So biochar, how is it made? What is it? What's it used for? Where does it come from? Okay, basically the way I came to biochar was trying to find a way of dealing with all the brash that comes out of hedgelaying, because as you can see perhaps it's always surprising how much actually comes out of the hedge after you've created your hedge through hedgelaying. And as a general rule, a lot often that just gets burnt up, and it seems quite wasteful. Back in the day, brash would have been used, you know, every last bit would have been used for something. Even the bits that they couldn't use for pea sticks and beam poles and tool handles would have been all bound up into faggots and used for the fire. So having a big bonfire and burning it all up at the end does seem quite wasteful. The process of making the biochar is what we're going to do today, and we've got this thing that I like to call a glorified skip, which is basically, it's called an Oregon kiln if you want to be posh about it, but essentially it is just a kind of skip shaped metal receptacle. We've got it on a stand today. We don't always do that, but it's quite good to have it up off the ground because it doesn't then burn the ground underneath it, but it does make it a bit more difficult to load when it's higher up. Essentially what we're going to do is very straightforward. We're just going to have a massive bonfire in the kiln. We're going to start off using a bit of dry wood that we've got in here and a bit of bracken, and then we're going to start off cutting up sticks quite small like you would for a normal bonfire and just build it up. And after hopefully an hour or so, the fire will be going really strongly, and then we can just load big branches on, and as the ends burn off we can feed the ends back into the fire. But obviously you'll see that process as we go. Hopefully we'll get all of this brash from, it was about 50 metres of hedge laying that we did last week, we'll get it all burnt today. So the actual process of making biochar in this way is a relatively simple one, but it leads us on to what biochar is actually useful for in the first place, and why we're doing it, other than to get rid of this big amount of material. Biochar, the difference between biochar and charcoal is basically pretty much just in the way that they're used, and sometimes in the way they're produced. Essentially it's a fine charcoal made from small material, stuff like this, whereas your lumpwood charcoal that you would use for your barbecue would be made out of bigger stuff and you get bigger lumps of it. So the main difference really is in the way that it's used. It's not used to burn, it's used in the soil as a soil amendment. And what it does in the soil essentially is to improve the soil structure. So if you've got a very clayey soil, it will help to aerate your soil because it's got this sort of micro-porous structure. Lots of little holes in it, a bit like a sponge on a very small scale. If you've got a very sandy soil, it will help to hold water in the soil as well. So basically, as I say, it's improving the structure of the soil in a physical way, but also it also has a chemical effect, and helps to hold nutrients to it in that way as well. As we add the char, the tapered sides help the char to sort of sink down and cover the char below it and prevent it from completely burning off, because obviously otherwise you'll end up with just a whole load of ash and not a lot of biochar. Okay, so yeah, we're just cutting up the hazel that's been cut out of the hedge. All of this stuff was stuff that wasn't needed when we laid the hedge. and just using a bill hook, always cutting away from the body and up the stick. We're just separating out the smaller bits from the bigger bits at the moment, because to start with, as we build the fire up, we just want to use all the small twiggy bits. The big stuff we can burn later. Yep, it's going. So we don't really need to cut everything up quite so small anymore, because the fire's going pretty well. At this stage we can put stuff on that just spans the diameter of the kiln, so as long as it fits on at this stage, that's good. And then the next stage will be to basically put things on pretty much whole, and they'll stick out, and then as the tops burn off we'll feed them in, but we're not quite at that stage yet. So yeah, this is good.
And how long has this been going so far?
We've probably only been going about half an hour, I would say. Okay, so we're at the stage now where we can basically put stuff on almost whole, but we don't want to end up creating a bridge right over the kiln which stops other things dropping down. So we're just going to put the bushy ends on like that and let the butt ends point out over the kiln, and then after maybe 10 or 15 minutes of loading like that, we will start loading from this direction. And what that will do is it will help to funnel the wind which is coming from here into the heart of the fire, and it will also then mean that once the tops are burnt off here, we can easily access the butt ends and put them back on top. So it's really important when you're having any sort of bonfire, let alone biochar, to be quite systematic in the way you load the brash. It's so easy to put a fire out even at this stage by giving it too much at one time. So yeah, patience is a virtue, apparently. Okay, so as you can see, we've got quite big bits on there now and the fire's going really well. We try and load it so that the brushy ends stay over the kiln, but sometimes bits fall down the back here. And the grass is quite dry. It's been a very dry winter. So there is a risk that you can set fire to the grass. So it's good to just, with a fork, clear that out, but you've got to be careful because of all the flames coming, because the wind's coming from over there. So you just have to kind of get down low and hoik this out. And then I've also got the shovel handy here in case a bit of grass does set fire. You can just put that out. And obviously we've also got water handy. It's really good to do it if you've got access to a hose pipe, because you can then just sort of damp things down as you work. But obviously that's not always practical, like in this situation. But compared to having a bonfire, it does damage the grass a lot less. In fact, it might be quite hot up the top, but underneath that kiln is actually very cool. So it will be barely singeing the grass under there. You can actually get right underneath without it being too hot. Most of the heat's going up and around. The kiln's getting pretty full now, and we're putting much bigger stuff on. This is a new technique invented. It's named after its inventor, Jolyon Lynham. It's called the Jolyon prop, and it's a special invention created today. so we can support the big long ends and they don't all tip back out of the fire. But yeah, the char is really starting to build up. We've been burning probably about 4 hours, so we might find that we're limited by the amount of space available in the kiln. It should fit about a cubic metre of biochar in it, and obviously once that's full we're going to have to start quenching. So yeah, as you can see, the kiln is pretty full now of char, and we're just scraping up the little bits that have fallen down, putting them back in the middle, and burning it all up, and we're going to wait till it goes down to embers before we start the quenching process. So basically these bits here are called brown ends, they're not quite burnt through yet. I think we'll leave it another 5 or 10 minutes and see if more of these will burn through and turn into char, but obviously the longer we leave it, the more ash is being formed. So we don't want to leave it too long and just end up with a load of ash. Okay, this is the fun bit then. So we're going to start quenching the char. Ideally you want to use a hose pipe because you can regulate it much better, but here we haven't been able to get access with the hose, so we've just brought some water in a barrel, and we're going to bucket it in. Obviously we can bucket from the stream as well if we need to, if we don't have enough. Yeah, it's good fun, makes some interesting sounds. And what we're looking at doing is not putting so much water on that we totally drench the char, but just enough that it actually puts it out, and then the residual heat should help to dry the char out a bit. So we've just got to find that balance. It's really easy to add too much water. Yeah, we can just hoik out any brown ends that we can see, and then I'm just sort of mixing it up and trying to uncover any hot spots. So you can see here it's still quite hot, so we're going to need to get a bit more water on this, but we don't want to make it too dry. We don't want to make it too wet, because it becomes very heavy. And also something we haven't spoken about yet is the process of activating the biochar, which is basically filling all the little pores in the biochar with a nutrient source. If all those pores get filled with water, then our liquid nutrient solution won't be able to enter into those pores because they'll be full of water. Yeah, so the process, once we've finished quenching this, what we then have is like the raw biochar, and if you added that straight to your soil, in the short term it would actually decrease the fertility in the soil, because all the nutrients that are in the soil will just be sucked into the biochar. So what you have to do before you add it, is to activate it, or some people call it charging it or inoculating it, with a nutrient source. My favourite way of doing that really is to put it through the composting process. So you put it in layers in a compost heap or a manure pile, and then as the compost degrades, the nutrients just they just end up in the char, and the charcoal will prevent nutrients from being leached out of the compost. But you can also use like liquid manures. You can make a liquid manure out of comfrey or stinging nettles or whatever and use that. At home we quite often use urine, which doesn't sound very attractive, but I think a lot of people probably don't know that urine contains the 6 nutrients that plants need to grow, or the 6 main nutrients that they need. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium and sulfur are all in your pee, in the perfect proportions for plants to grow. So if you can find a way of separating out your urine and then putting that into the biochar, that's a really good nutrient source. And other options would be to mix it with farmyard manure or even with slurry before applying the slurry to the fields. But yeah, it is important to have a source of nutrients for the biochar to absorb before you add it to your soil. I think we're almost there, so we'll just keep turning for a little bit, Jolyon, because
we'll just bring the other buckets there then.
yeah, because what we're trying to do is find a balance between not making sure it's out, but not saturating it too much with water, because it makes it very heavy, and then obviously your nutrients can't soak in. I've yet to have had one that's reignited, but I wouldn't like this to be the first time that it's happened because all this work will be for nothing if it starts burning again. So yeah, I'm just shoveling it into this bucket because the bucket is 33 litres, so I know that 3 of these buckets is 100 litres, and generally I'll put 6 buckets in a dumpy sack. That's 200 litres, and that's about how much we can carry with 2 people. But here, obviously, because we're going to move it with the tractor, we can put more in. But still, it's always interesting to know how much you've put in, so how much the burn has yielded. So that's 2 buckets. Oops. That's 3, so that's 100 litres. Right, so how many is that? 4. 5, that one is, isn't it?
I said I wasn't reliable.
So we've kind of made it a little bit too wet. There's a little bit of moisture at the base of the kiln, but it's still quite warm, so it will dry a bit. But what's important is to store this somewhere where it's not going to be exposed to too much rain, because as I said before, we don't want to end up with the char being completely soaked and all the pores being filled with water. We've basically got 2 dumpy sacks, about 350 litres in each one. We've been measuring as we went. So 700 litres of biochar. It's taken us about 6 or 7 hours today to do this burn. And the advantage of what we've done here over having a bonfire is, instead of letting it all burn down to ash, we've ended up with the 700 litres of biochar, which is effectively mostly carbon. Obviously there's some wood ash in there as well, which has a liming effect, and it also has trace elements in it and lots of potassium. So you wouldn't want to add this to an acidic soil. But yeah, this is all carbon that's now been fixed, and if that all goes into the soil, it will persist there for many, many hundreds of years. They've found areas in South America where they have this black earth in the rainforest, because generally rainforest soils are very poor, but they've found areas where they have a black earth and they're extremely fertile. And what they discovered is that the reason for the high fertility of the soil is that it's actually full of ancient charcoal that was produced thousands of years ago by the civilizations that lived there. So yeah, it's called black earth, terra preta, black gold.